I have a question. As I transition from my 5 videos about things that are not necessarily culturally deaf to 5 things that are part of the deaf culture. That question, sign language interpreters, are they culturally deaf? So American Sign Language is the core of deaf culture. It is what sets apart deafness as not just a disability group, but a cultural group. They have a shared language. That language has its own syntax and grammar. And that is my video for next week about sign language. But interpreters, are they deaf, culturally deaf? Or is it just something that goes along with deaf individuals, but isn't necessarily part of the culture? Um, One study I found said 57% of today's sign language interpreters have family members who are deaf. And I don't doubt that from the sign language interpreters that I know, many of them grew up around the deaf community. They knew sign language, communicated in sign language with a family member before becoming an interpreter themselves. From the interactions with deaf people that I know, they love their sign language interpreters for the most part, of course. They appreciate sign language interpreters. Um, Sign language interpreters provide access for deaf sign language users to the hearing English speaking world, or the world that speaks another language. There's interpreters for the deaf people to the verbal communicators. Um, in 2005, a code of professional conduct was written for sign language interpreters to follow. Um, So if a sign language interpreter is not following the code of professional conduct, there is chances that they could get their interpreting license removed. I was actually part of the interpreter review board in Nebraska, and part of the discussions of potential removals of sign language interpreting license for the different reasons of interpreters not following code of professional conduct. So it is a profession that is taken very seriously. There is um, professional conduct that is required. Um, and the deaf community, for the most part, loves their interpreters. So why am I questioning if sign language interpreters are or are not part of deaf culture, especially when sign language is such a core to the deaf culture. The interpreters are that third party between the deaf world and the hearing world. If there's a deaf student in a school, the rest of the students know that that's the deaf kid because they are the one that has a sign language interpreter following them to all of their classes. There's at large events when there's a sign language interpreter or interpreters for the event. There's often a deaf section where the deaf people sit so they can best see the sign language interpreter. When a deaf person is trained to do a job, there's a sign language interpreter who follows them around to make sure that the communication is clear of their job training. Anything that the deaf person is being trained to do is relayed through the sign language interpreter. That interpreter is learning the job and relaying it alongside that deaf person. If a deaf person goes to mental health counseling, anything that the deaf person shares with the counselor is being communicated through that sign language interpreter, shared to the interpreter and then voiced into English for the counselor. So they create a bridge from the deaf world to the hearing world. So it can be possibly uncomfortable to share all of your life, all of your world that is on that bridge with a third party person to bridge that gap. If you know an interpreter well, you might not want them to know the deep, dark secrets that you might share with a mental health counselor. So what should the hearing service provider, what should we keep in mind? What should we do about this third party that is a big part of the deaf culture, but not necessarily deaf culture? They are the bridge between deaf culture and hearing culture. I believe that it's important for hearing service providers to keep in mind that having that interpreter it's a common occurrence for the deaf person and a hearing person. It might be their first time interacting with a deaf person and with an interpreter. But keep in mind that it might not be comfortable for the deaf person to share everything with that interpreter, even though it's their everyday experience. So having an empathy for that. And some deaf people might not want specific interpreters for specific situations. They might have an interpreter preference for, say, a job interview. They might prefer a certain interpreter. And there's also different ways that different people communicate. So some people might prefer certain interpreters for certain situations. Even if it is a fully licensed code of conduct following sign language interpreter, there could be preferences that deaf people have for one interpreter over another in different situations. So giving something to think about when considering the deaf community and using sign language interpreters. So food for thought until next week's video when I discuss a little bit more about American Sign Language and the deaf community. So until next time, this is Jessica Nichols with Agape Pod.
Agape